what was the name of the person you wanted to make co-host?
Amanda.
Is he in as an attendee right now?
She's as a panelist.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. More people might be joining, but thank you for joining our virtual session today on matching in markets with information frictions. This is my first session doing this virtually, so we'll see how it goes. The plan is to go in the order of the program. Presenters will have 20 minutes, then discussants will have about 10 minutes, and then we'll do kind of a 5 to 8 minute Q&A after each one, since we only have 3 papers. If you have a question, you should feel free to either write it in the Q&A box, or you can kind of raise your hand and I'll allow you to talk or try that feature anyway during the Q&A session. So thanks everyone for being here, and let's go ahead and get started with Russell.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Looking forward to hearing your feedback on this paper, which is joint work with Ron Laschever, who's at Compass Lexecon. So understanding how firms match with workers is central to our understanding of labor markets, and yet this process still very much remains a black box. And it's important to understand the frictions that underlie this process, as well as whether there are mechanisms that might help reduce those frictions and improve outcomes for workers and firms. And so in this paper, we ask whether firms and workers benefit when applicants for a given job can credibly reveal their interest in that job through an auction for interviews. And just to fix ideas at the beginning, this is an auction with fake money. So there are 2 important frictions that auctions for interviews could help address in the market. The first is that when firms are selecting which applicants to invite for interviews, they might have a really hard time identifying which are the applicants in the pool that are really interested in the job and likely to accept an offer. And this is likely especially a concern given the rise of online job postings and job applications, which have decreased the cost of applying to jobs and raised the likelihood that marginally interested applicants are in the pool. And so if firms are interviewing and making offers to these marginally interested applicants, that could decrease the number or the quality of hires. It's easy to see how this might be especially problematic for less desirable firms who are competing with more desirable firms for the same applicants and thus more likely to have their offers rejected. And so the auction can help applicants to credibly reveal their interest in the job, which could be useful information for firms. The second friction is that an applicant's true quality is likely not conveyed perfectly through their resume, but might be much better conveyed or revealed through a face-to-face interview. And so the auction gives applicants the ability to reveal that quality in a face-to-face interview. And so we're going to focus on 2 research questions here. The first is whether auctions help less desirable firms to hire desirable candidates. And the second is whether auctions improve representation of overlooked candidates among hires. So it's not very common that labor markets allow applicants an opportunity to credibly reveal their interest in a job. Given that we're all at the AEA meetings, we're probably thinking about the signaling mechanism that is allowed in the job market for economists. The important difference here relative to our setting is that the AEA signal is a non-binding signal for firms. So firms do not have to interview the people who send signals, whereas in our setting with auctions, firms have to interview the highest bidding auction participants. There's very little evidence on these interview auctions, which are really common at the most prestigious MBA programs in the United States, as well as at several other master's degree programs in the United States. And so we think that there's a reason to think more about implementing them more broadly in the labor market, and two areas that we see as promising include in local job centers, as well as in intranet job posting and job application sites. So I'll give a quick preview of the results. So first, we do find that less desirable firms use auctions to hire desirable applicants. In particular, they're nearly twice as likely to hire desirable auction winners. These are candidates that they overlooked in the resume screening process relative to the candidates that they selected for interviews. We don't see this pattern for high desirability firms. And so we see the evidence together as consistent with a story in which less desirable firms perceive a higher rejection rate among when they give offers to invitees, whereas more desirable firms are not as concerned about offer rejection. Second, we find that auctions increase overlooked candidates' representation among high desirability hires. We especially see effects for those with less prestigious experience on their resume, as well as non-US citizens. And finally, we find in our counterfactual analysis that there's a 13% increase in firms who fail to hire if you were to abandon this auction mechanism. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the setting. We study a professional master's degree program at a large university that has a high placement rate, with many students ending up in the Fortune 500. There's a formal on-campus recruiting program that has this auction component. And we're going to focus on internship recruiting because this is these students' entry into this market for this specialized occupation. And also about 50% of internships in our sample convert to full-time jobs. And so we're also concerned that if we looked at full-time recruiting, we'd have a highly selected sample of people who didn't get offers from their internship employer. So here's a timeline. Firms that want to recruit formally on campus, they agree to have 50% of their interviews chosen by this auction. So a firm comes to campus and they commit to interviewing, let's say, 20 applicants. Individuals apply to the job. The firm reviews the applications and invites 10 applicants for interviews. It lets those 10 applicants know that they've been invited, and it lets everybody else know that they have not been invited for an interview. At that point, there's an auction that takes place for the remaining 10 interview slots, and the highest bidders are awarded those 10 interview slots. And so then the firm interviews the full 20 applicants, 10 applicants which it chose, and 10 applicants which it did not choose, and in fact overlooked in the resume screening process, but came on through the auction. So at the beginning of the semester, each applicant or student receives 1,000 bid points, and they can use those bid points as they wish throughout the semester. So students can choose to spend all of their points on one auction, or they can spend the points and spread them across several different auctions. If you don't win the bid, then you actually get your points returned to you to use in a future bid. We have really rich data from a couple of different sources. So at the student level, we have data from their admissions applications for the graduate program. We see their applicant profiles on the job portal that they use to apply to these jobs. We also have their actual resumes that they submitted to these employers, from which we obtain their undergraduate major, institution, and GPA, as well as their work experience. So we use the company names on the website to code whether these students had work experience at Fortune 1000 companies or Forbes Global 2000 companies, for example. We have administrative data from the school on employment outcomes. And then in addition, we have job posting applicant matched data. So for each job posting applicant pair, we know whether the firm invited the applicant for an interview, and we know whether they, the applicant, if they weren't invited, whether they participated in the auction, whether they won the auction, and ultimately whether they got the interview. We have 180 job postings and 430 applicants in our sample. So first, I just want to make the point that this is a setting in which auctions could help. So first, it's a congested market. So firms are only inviting a very small number of their applicants for interviews, which implies that they may be leaving many desirable as well as interested applicants in the pool of applicants, and the auction could help to identify those individuals. Second, this is a market in which there's very little coordination among firms. And so we see a large number of firms interviewing or concentrating their interviews on a much smaller number of applicants. And so the average invited candidate has about 6 invitations, whereas most applicants have less than or equal to 2. So the auction is a mechanism that can help distribute applicants across interview schedules. Related to that, we see that low and high desirability firms are inviting the same applicants, which again raises the concern that these less desirable firms are going to have a high offer rejection rate if they make offers to the people that they invited for interviews, because those people were also invited by more desirable firms. Finally, we see evidence that offers are costly. So if offers weren't costly, then it's less important to identify interested applicants because firms could just keep making offers until somebody accepts. But if offers are costly to make, then it's important to identify these individuals who will more likely accept the offer. And so the auction can perform that role. So it's going to be useful for us to have one measure of student desirability and one measure of firm desirability. So as a proxy for student desirability, we're going to use the predicted number of interview invitations that the student receives. So we've regressed the total number of invitations on characteristics X and on the total applications that the student sent that semester for jobs. And then we're going to take this X beta hat as our measure of student desirability, and we're going to standardize it to be mean 0 and standard deviation 1. So here you can see from these coefficients from this interview invitation prediction regression that Asian applicants receive fewer invitations, that those who have experience before their master's degree that's similar to the occupation that they're applying for get more invitations. Those who have experience at these large companies get more invitations. And those who have the highest GPAs get more invitations. We also see business majors get more invitations relative to psychology majors. Our measure of firm desirability is an index that measures the firm's average percentile in the semester's salary distribution over the course of the 9 semesters in our data. So these plots just show, consistent with what I showed you earlier from the prediction regression, that auction winners really look different from invited candidates. So auction winners are less likely to have the highest GPAs as undergraduates. Auction winners are less likely to have this experience at large companies. Auction winners are slightly less likely to be Black and Hispanic, but they're much more likely to be Asian. And so this auction mechanism does seem to be giving opportunities to candidates with characteristics that tend to be overlooked by firms. Here I plot the distribution of our student desirability measure, and I want to make 3 main points from these plots. The first is that if you look here on the left, that the distribution of desirability for auction winners is shifted to the left of that for invitees. And so on the whole, auction winners look like they have less desirable characteristics based on this measure. But there's a lot of overlap. So firms are leaving a lot of desirable applicants in the pool. And in particular, about 40% of auction winners have desirability at or above the mean. And so it's going to be relevant for us to ask whether firms are more likely to hire high desirability auction winners relative to those that they invited for interviews. And then lastly, we can see that if you look at this distribution for invited candidates at low and high desirability firms, they look very similar, which again suggests that these low and high desirability firms are inviting similar students and raises the concern that there might be coordination problems that especially fall upon these less desirable firms. And the auction might help with those issues. So finally, we just show descriptive evidence here that for the least desirable firms, they're much more likely to hire high desirability auction winners than they are to hire high desirability people that they invited. But we see the opposite for the most desirable firms. Again, we see this as consistent with low desirability firms benefiting from information on applicant interest in the job. So we test this more formally in a regression where the dependent variable is an indicator for whether individual I is hired for job posting S in semester T. We have job posting fixed effects, and beta 1 tells us the differential likelihood that a firm hires an auction winner, somebody that they did not invite for an interview, relative to somebody that they invited for the average desirability auction student. Beta 3 tells us how this differential likelihood of hiring an auction winner increases with the student's desirability. So these are our main results. Column 1 shows that for low desirability firms, for the average desirability student, auction winners are slightly more likely to be hired relative to invited candidates, but not precisely. But we see that that differential likelihood of hiring an auction winner increases with the student's desirability. So for students who have a desirability measure that's 1 standard deviation above the mean, firms are 5.5 percentage points more likely to hire the auction winner, the candidate that they looked over in the resume screening stage, relative to the candidate that they invited for an interview. And we don't see this pattern for the high desirability firms, which again, we see as consistent with these low desirability firms being more concerned about offers being rejected, and so benefiting from this information on applicant interest, whereas that's less of a concern for the more desirable firms. Column 3 shows that this differential likelihood of hiring an auction winner actually increases with the bid of the auction winner. So just to make this more interpretable, we see that high desirability auction winners that bid 500 out of their allotment of 1,000, so these people are bidding a lot in this auction, half of their total points, are 14 percentage points more likely to be hired than invitees of similar desirability. So we see this as really important evidence that the auction is actually providing some really important information relative to a counterfactual in which firms got to choose all of their interviewees, because the auction is identifying these really high bidding students, which the firm might have a hard time identifying in the pool of applicants without the auction. A second piece of evidence that this auction is providing some beneficial information relative to the counterfactual is that auction winners are more likely to stay for a full-time job. Auction winners that are hired for internships are more likely to stay for a full-time job relative to invited candidates who are hired as interns. Again, suggesting that this auction is revealing information that's otherwise less accessible. We have much less power on this evidence, but it's certainly suggestive. And then finally, we confirm that auction winners are more likely to accept an offer conditional on getting an offer, which again suggests that this auction is providing this role of identifying interested applicants. So the second set of questions is whether getting a foot in the door helps less desirable applicants. And the answer to this question is not obvious, because firms might just simply hire the auction winners who are more desirable and not change the composition of hires. So we test for these compositional differences by just regressing characteristics X on whether the individual was an auction winner. So here we can see, just based on simple means, that among interviewees at low desirability firms, invitees have much higher desirability measures than auction winners, which is consistent with everything we've seen so far. What's interesting is that among hires, this difference in desirability is much reduced. And that's basically because here, while these low desirability firms are inviting very desirable applicants, they're not hiring them. And to a lesser extent, they're hiring the more desirable of the auction winners. And so the auction does not really seem to be shifting the composition of hires for these less desirable firms. We see something quite different for the more desirable firms, and that is that this difference in desirability persists among hires. And so when these more desirable firms are hiring auction winners, it looks like they're hiring very different types of applicants. So we can break that down into the components of this desirability index. So if you look at the far right-hand column here, you can see that among interviewees, auction winners are 13 percentage points less likely to have this experience at large firms. And that difference persists among hires. So it's not the case that when firms hire auction winners, they're simply hiring the auction winners that had experience at these prestigious companies. Similarly, we see that among interviewees, auction winners are more likely to be Asian. And we see that that difference persists among hires. So it's not the case that when firms hire auction winners, they're only hiring the non-Asian auction winners. Finally, we're interested in how the auction affects likelihood of hiring non-US citizens. So about 70% of our postings are restricted to people who are US citizens or permanent residents. So here we restrict to those that allow applications from non-US citizens. And we find that auction winners are 31 percentage points less likely to be US citizens than invited candidates, and that difference persists among hires. So it's not the case that firms are simply hiring the auction winners that are US citizens. And we see that as really important and interesting evidence. So I've said several times that we're interested in whether this auction is doing something better than the counterfactual, in which firms got to choose all of their interviewees. As a last piece of evidence, we do a counterfactual exercise in which we replace the auction winners with counterfactual invites. And we do that based on what we see in the data, which was that firms are leaving a lot of desirable applicants in the pool. So it's not as if they're only inviting the most desirable applicants and leaving all the rest. So we assume that if firms got to invite all of their applicants, they would simply replicate what they're doing right now. So if they invited one person at the top of the distribution and 3 people in the middle, they would do the same if they got to invite everybody. So this yields counterfactual invites with 7.5 other interview opportunities, while auction winners have 5 other interviews. So that really highlights that this counterfactual is going to show the auction to be beneficial because it's putting people on the interview schedule who have fewer other interview opportunities. And so that's what this counterfactual is going to focus on. And we're not going to allow firms to make offers to auction winners based on their perceived lower likelihood of rejecting the offer. So then we simulate this offer and acceptance game. We do 1,000 simulations with the auctions and 1,000 without. In each scenario, we keep the interviewees fixed, but with each simulation, we draw different firm preferences over interviewees, and we draw different student preferences over firms. And then we have firms make offers to their most preferred student based on those preferences, and we have students accept the offer from their most preferred firm. So this top panel here shows the results from assuming that firms have random preferences over their interviewees or uncorrelated. And that's going to make us least likely to find the auction to be beneficial because it's going to suggest that firms are really unlikely to make an offer to somebody who's also getting an offer from another firm because the preferences are uncorrelated. Despite that, we see that the auction seems to have some effect on, some small effect on the likelihood that the vacancy is filled. Where we see a big effect is when we assume that firms agree on the above median interviewees. And that seems to us a really reasonable assumption based on the correlated preferences among firms that we see in the data. So here we see that the median number of firms that fail to hire is 13% greater if you were to abandon this auction mechanism. And again, that's because the auction is putting people on the interview schedule who have fewer other interview opportunities. And so if firms end up making offers to those people, it's less likely they're getting offers from other firms. So just to wrap up, in this paper, we look at whether matching would improve in the labor market if applicants could credibly signal their interest in a job. We have 3 main findings. The first is that less desirable firms use auctions to hire desirable candidates, and it looks like that's because it's helping them to identify interested applicants. Second, we find that auctions increase hires for often overlooked applicants, and importantly for those with less prestigious experience or those who aren't US citizens. And finally, we see evidence that auctions decrease unfilled vacancies. And so based on these results, we see that there's potential in thinking about implementing these auctions more broadly in the labor market and potentially in online job application sites or local job centers. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much. Lisa, I think you're up discussing.
Okay, fantastic. Everybody see my slides and hear me? Awesome, great, thanks, thumbs up. Okay, thanks for inviting me to discuss this awesome paper. What Russell does is he looks at this specialized master's program where on-campus or companies come on campus to recruit, and the companies get to pick half the interview slots, and then the other half the interview slots are up for offer on auction by the students, and the students bid points to get these interview slots. So the question is basically, can this screening mechanism help resolve information asymmetries, because the auction really reveals who's most excited about this particular firm. And the findings are that less desirable firms are more likely to make offers and hire higher quality auction winners. And more desirable firms are less impacted, which kind of makes sense. The auctions increase hiring of candidates with less desirable observables, and he can actually pinpoint which observables are the ones that tend to be overlooked. And the simulation suggests that the auction itself facilitates hiring or facilitates efficiency in this market. And so the punchline is that mechanisms that can allow candidates to credibly signal their interest can increase efficiency. And I think this is really cool. I'm gonna point out this quote from the Euler and Schaefer handbook chapter in personnel economics that I use to justify a lot of my own papers. And the to punchline it, what they basically say is economists really have figured out incentives. We got the theory of incentives. We got a lot of empirical evidence of incentives. What we really haven't figured out is hiring. If you think about it, hiring and how workers match to different firms is just crucial. And in personnel economics, this process is mainly a black box, but it's so crucial for us to understand. So their handbook chapter is a big plea for people to study hiring. And so fantastic that Russell is studying hiring. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is, in general, when we think of hiring and we think of information asymmetries in hiring, we have two potential solutions for these information asymmetries. We have signaling, where workers can take costly actions to convey their type, to credibly convey their type. And we have screening, where the idea is that firms want to set up the hiring process to better facilitate worker signaling and self-selection. And we have tons of anecdotes for number two, and I teach anecdotes for number two all the time. So we have things like employers make you do some kind of mock presentation that may not even be all that related to the job, just to give you a hurdle to apply so we get some self-selection. I used to teach this business case called S.G. Cowan about a company trying to hire MBA students, and that case is actually kind of problematic in 2020, sort of thinking about it now. But one thing that was pretty interesting about that was, for students who were applying from top universities, the company actually made them bend over backwards to try to get an interview. They didn't go to their campuses because they wanted workers who they thought would not be attainable to actually self-select and take a costly action to come and find them. So these types of anecdotes are everywhere, and theory suggests that this should be an important part of hiring. But we really don't have that much evidence on this second point here. Except for, the paper on the AA signaling, for example. So I think this is a great contribution to the hiring literature. My complaint about the paper thus far is that it needs to be reined in a little bit, and it's a little bit hard to interpret just a plethora of cool kind of stylized facts that are coming out of this. So I would just going to focus my comments a little bit on how we might be able to interpret this sets of stylized facts. And so that involves thinking about the employer's problem. So the expected value of posting a job in this environment and having an interview schedule in this environment is the probability that you fill the job times the quality of the person you hire, plus the probability you don't fill the job, times the walkaway value, or the probability or the quality if you don't hire somebody. And there are F subscripts here because all of these things can vary by firm. So individual firms need to choose the number of interviews, the observable quality of interviews, and then the quality of their hires to maximize the expected value. And we do think high quality firms are going to have a higher likelihood of hiring conditional on observable quality. But of course, firms can also differ in the quality of a hire. So firms could differ in terms of the return to quality and how much they want a very high quality worker versus how much they just want any worker. And firms can differ in the walkaway value. And one thing that I thought was pretty interesting is this time period of this paper is 2008 to 2012. And Russell, I think, is like me and very frequently has recessions on the brain. And in this particular setting, it might be the case that firms actually don't mind not hiring during 2009 and 2010. And that could differ across firm quality. That is to say that although the auction reveals information about P, which is the probability that you can hire a worker for a subset of applicants who participate in the auction, we don't know what the end result of that could be, because some firms might really want to make sure somebody shows up to their job, and other firms might just say, I'm going to shoot for the stars and I only want somebody if they're a star because I have a huge return to quality and I don't mind so much if I don't hire somebody. So there are implications about P times Q, and the auction helps because it reveals information about P. But it's sort of hard to find unambiguous predictions about any subset of P's and Q's across high and low quality firms, high and low quality applicants. And so that's what makes it a bit confusing to interpret the results in the paper. I should also say, of course, that the auction might reveal something about match quality if candidates have private information about that. So what are the implications here, given that I've already said it was a little confusing, is that One thing is actually, is there evidence that firms are trading off P and Q? Is it the case that the observable quality of auction winners and auction hires is worse than interviewees because interviewees, maybe they target really high quality and they know auction winners are targeting high probability of coming? And then there can be a range of interesting descriptives about what observables are offset the most between P's and Q's. And that's actually, Russell does a ton of that in the paper. And so you could actually interpret this figure as exactly showing this trade-off between P and Q, especially for the less desirable firms. Their invitees are just as good on observable quality as the invitees of high desirable firms. And the auction winners are quite a bit lower on observable quality, but they're probably much higher on P. And so this really does look like some kind of offset. It's not as though these firms, the lower desirability firms, are hedging on the quality of their solicited interviewers. They're sort of treating that as option value because they know they could have a high P from the auction winners. So that's kind of an interesting, I think, there are also questions about what is the impact of the auction by firm quality. And we think the value of the auction should be larger for lower quality firms. But again, that should probably show up in P times Q as opposed to just P or just Q. And so I think for me, it was a little bit hard to see how some of the statistics that were reported in the paper, which are mechanisms into this, the P times Q element of it all, are how do they add up? So that might be a nice sort of organizing framework if you want to look at the probability of hire in the auction versus the interview, the quality of hire in the auction versus the interview. Those could probably add up to a bit more of how is it that lower quality firms benefit from this auction. It's because they have a set of people that give them a higher P, which enables them to then make a different optimizing choice over P times Q, essentially. And so that was just sort of how I was thinking about the results. I have some detailed comments which I'll pass to Russell, but I just want to conclude and say that I think that this is a fantastic exploration, and I think they're only at the surface of what they can learn about this mechanism. I'd also like to know why I think it was the case that they ended up getting rid of the mechanism after the time period in the data, given that it seems so efficient. I kind of wondered why that was, but either way, as economists, I think we love it for the reasons that Russell said and for the reasons that I said. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how it evolves. That's it.
Great, thanks, Lisa. So I think what we're going to try to do now is when people have questions, if you can try to raise your hand, I'll try to unmute you and we can see how that works. Alan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks, Russell. I really echo Lisa's comments too. I think it's really neat to open the black box of hiring. I guess you mentioned, you kind of hinted that you're interested in expanding this to the broader labor market. And kind of my first gut reaction would have been like an auction to apply for a job could have very detrimental distributional impacts. Like Mandy has a paper on like a $6 ACT application discourages people from applying, or sorry, from applying to more colleges, for example. I was wondering if you had any ideas of how you thought you might practically roll this out, or if you thought this is more about like this more applied mechanism design application, like in this setting.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good question. So I guess I was not thinking about implementing it with real money. So that I guess would solve some of those issues. Just making it costly in some sense, like giving people a fixed resource that they can't, spend in a limited amount, which still would make any bid sort of a costly revelation of interest. But yeah, I think, there are a lot of questions about how exactly this could be implemented in a real labor market that involve a lot of those issues. And yeah, I'm not there yet, but at the point of just seeing like there's potential, and seems like there are places that it could be useful, and a lot of questions to think through. So yeah, I think that's a good point.
I think it's fair to point out like college admissions and like some employers are charging to apply for jobs.
For sure, yeah.
So it's already there, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Thanks.
Joanna?
Hi, I was wondering, I know I should probably be able to back this out from some of your figures, but I I was wondering if there's different selection and who applies to the different design, who uses their points on the different kinds of firms. Because I sort of have some of your results, I was like, well, that might be explained by the people who are like really the lowest quality, having overinflated ideas about their own value and spending all of their points on the highest firms. And so I was just kind of wondering, like, you know, the firms or the interviewees are of similar quality, are the auctionees of similar quality across the firms?
Great. Yeah, it's a great question. So I guess the most simple answer is that you know, we're controlling for student desirability based on these measured observable characteristics, and so we're comparing auction winners with similar desirability based on their observables to invited candidates with, you know, the same desirability based on their observables, you know, by controlling in this linear fashion for desirability. So that's the main thing. I think the question about whether different applicants behave differently in the auction and use their points differently is a really interesting question. You know, I think as economists, we tend to think about sort of optimal strategies in auctions, and that's where our mind goes. So I think we're interested in that. We have not done a ton of work on, you know, the optimal strategy and looking at the student strategies across auctions. See that as sort of an area for future research. One thing that we do show is that winning the auction is not correlated with your GMAT score or your GRE score. And so we thought that was important evidence that auction winners aren't, for example, selected on some kind of unobservable ability, that winning the auction shows you're just a higher ability person because you had the ability it takes to figure out how to win an auction. And it doesn't look like there's evidence of that. But yeah, I think it's a good point.
Any other questions or thoughts on this paper? Okay, thank you so much. Let's move on to the next one with Seth presenting.
Great, thanks Lisa for the discussion. Those are great points. I'll be thinking a lot about them.
Thanks everybody. Can you see my screen here? And you can hear me, I guess. That's good. Okay, well, thanks for having me to this virtual session. Thanks to Russell for organizing, to our wonderful discussants as well. So this paper that I'm presenting is called Evaluating School Choice Mechanism Changes. It's joint work with Adam Kapor and Chris Neilson, both at Princeton. We're going to be thinking about the design of assignment mechanisms in a school choice setting. So a lot of cities in the United States use centralized choice systems. What these sort of systems have in common is that applicants report rank order lists of schools to some centralized authority, and that authority takes those applications and assigns students to potentially over-demanded schools using some combination of priorities for things like neighborhood and sibling status, and then random lotteries. Where cities really differ in terms of how they implement these centralized assignment mechanisms is in the mechanism they use. And this has important implications for the way applicants need to approach the mechanism. The two most common approaches you see in practice are the immediate acceptance, or IA mechanism, which is used in places like Cambridge, Charlotte, Seattle, and the deferred acceptance, or DA mechanism, which is used in places like Boston, New York, and Denver. And the key difference, or a key difference between these two approaches, is that the deferred acceptance mechanism is strategy proof. So your best, or at least has the goal of being strategy proof. Some cities don't quite attain that, but that's what they're trying to do. And your best approach in that setting is to just list the schools you like in the order that you like them. In contrast, the immediate acceptance mechanism is not strategy proof. And you can actually it rewards informed strategic play for doing things like listing a very risky school first on your application in order to gain an admissions advantage. So that's the kind of play that it rewards. And economists have guided switches from IA to DA in several cities, including Boston, as well as the wholesale adoption of new DA systems in cities like New York. This is really one of the signature applications of market design in this century so far, maybe ever. And it's the theory underlying these switches is that the simplicity of strategy-proof DA sort of outweighs the benefits of expressiveness that you might get in immediate acceptance. And I say theory here because these switches are really guided by theory without too much empirical evidence, at least about what happens when you switch. On the empirical side, we've seen a number of recent papers that try to take this idea to the data and sort of evaluate, for example, the welfare implications of these changes. We've made a lot of progress here, but there's still some important areas where things could be improved, in particular when it comes to actual evidence on what happens when a switch takes place. The current state of the art in this literature is to do something like this. You observe applications under immediate acceptance. You use those applications to learn about what students' preferences are. You make some assumption about what people would do if the mechanism were different, if it were deferred acceptance. And then you combine that assumption with the preferences you've estimated to simulate what would happen under DA. And then compare that to what you actually saw under IA. Now, I've contributed to this literature. I think we've made some important progress there. But the obvious limitation is that we might be wrong on several dimensions, both in terms of what preference estimates we're getting and also in what we're assuming about people will do following the policy change. So the goal of this paper is to provide some direct evidence on how strategies change when the mechanism changes, in particular when a district does this sort of canonical switch from IA to DA. And we're going to construct this evidence using surveys sort of before and after a switch from IA to DA in New Haven, Connecticut, my now hometown again. So these surveys ask about beliefs, preferences, and strategies before and after the mechanism change. And the main thing, we're going to do three things in this paper in the big picture, but the main thing we're going to talk about today is this point. So we're going to be asking whether play, whether the applications that people submit changes in ways that are predicted by theory and typically assumed in empirical work. So the simulation approaches that we normally see mostly assume that following the switch to DA, people will play optimally in DA, which you can sort of rationalize by saying, well, DA, it's not too hard to do this. The rule is simple, but it doesn't necessarily mean that people will do it. And in fact, that there are real reasons to worry here. So if you look at theory, there is a set of results sort of arguing that strategies in deferred acceptance are easy to describe let me rephrase that. In DA, it's easy to describe what the optimal strategy is, but it's pretty hard to figure out. And if you look at lab evidence, you often see that people, in fact, do not figure it out. They will, inappropriately strategize in DA. And we see similar things when we go to the field, when we look at actual data. You can look at evidence from college admission systems in other countries, as well as from, say, the national residency match in the US. And you'll often see that applicants to these systems, who we might think are very sophisticated, sort of high human capital individuals, are often likely to report play that's not optimal. They'll inappropriately strategize, for example, or do things that appear just to leave money on the table. And we might be really worried that this will also show up in public school choice. So mostly today, we're going to be talking about this. In the long run, this paper is also going to think more specifically about how well estimates from pre-specified models end up fitting the data we see when the mechanism changes, and what this means for the welfare conclusions we draw. But a first step in that is this descriptive analysis, which is what we'll be talking about. So before I dive into the empirical details, I want to give you a sense of a quick sketch of the differences between immediate acceptance and deferred acceptance, and what we should be looking for to happen when the mechanism changes. So the fundamental difference between immediate acceptance and deferred acceptance is that deferred acceptance is strategy proof. You should list the schools you like in order that you like them, whereas in immediate acceptance, you may not want to do that. So one thing we would hope to see when the mechanism changes is more truthful applications. People should be more likely to list the schools they like in order. Why does this happen? Well, the reason that IA is not strategy proof is that you essentially get an admissions bonus from putting a school higher up on your application, towards the top of your list. And this gives you an opportunity to express the intensity of your preferences by, for example, listing a school you really like first on your application, even though doing so is very risky, right? So in deferred acceptance, there's no real relationship between the intensity of your preferences for a school and whether you should list that school first. You should just list things in order, regardless of whether you like A a lot more than B or just a little bit more. But under immediate acceptance, you may want to signal that you, or maybe optimal to list a school you really like first. Sorry, let me recalibrate here. Under I, you may not want to do that, essentially. And it allows you to signal the intensity of your preferences to the mechanism by listing schools you really like first, being more likely to list schools you really like first in your application. Sorry, this Zoom thing is a little bit, is getting to me a little bit. In any case, it's clear that if you're making this kind of calculation about, well, I'm willing to list this school first because even though my chances are low because I really like it, another input to that choice is your beliefs about your admissions chances. And that is an input to play in IA as well, whereas that's not an input to play in DA, right? The rule that I should list what I like in the order that I like it, there's no sense in which I care about what my admissions chances actually are to follow that strategy. Now, in practice, DA is often implemented with constrained lists. So this means that DA is no longer strategy proof, but it's still less manipulable than IA at any list length. Now, there's sort of a technical literature on this. And your best strategy in DA with constrained lists is still going to be to list the schools on your application in the order that you like them. You just may want to drop some schools from your list if you think you're unlikely to get in, essentially. So this is what we should be looking for when we take to the data. Let me tell you a little bit about where those data come from. So our setting for this study is New Haven, Connecticut. It's a lower income, majority minority urban district with about 20,000 kids. It's used centralized school choice in some form since the 90s. We're going to focus on high school choice for families living in New Haven in the years 2015 through 2019. There's about 1,600 students that participate in that choice process each year, and they choose between 12 high schools. So New Haven has used an IA or IA-like mechanism from the 90s through 2018. In 2019, they switched from IA with an application length of 4 schools to DA with the same application length. And the reason they did this is that we wrote Adam and Chris and I wrote a previous paper about this that showed that people in New Haven were trying to strategize in this IA mechanism, but they were doing so on the basis of inaccurate beliefs about their admissions chances. So we took this result to the district, and in part because of that, and I think also in part because they wanted to sort of adopt current best practices in cities like Boston and New York, they decided to switch to deferred acceptance. Across this switch, they kept student-facing features of choice the same. So the choice platform that students use, the priority system, the approach to outreach, those are all pretty similar before and after the mechanism. What the district was able to do as sort of part of the mechanism change was to give students more concrete advice on strategy. They were able to, in particular, give students the recommendation that they should list schools in the order that they like them, which they weren't able to do before the change. There's no real similar advice you can give under IA, except for to say that, hey, you should try to think carefully about how much you like schools and whether you can get in or not. So the data we use, both our previous paper and this one, come from surveys of actual and potential choice participants. We have a variety of surveys. We conducted an online survey of participants in 2019 and household surveys in 2015, 2017, and 2019. So both before and after the change. We're going to focus in our discussion today on respondents from the household surveys who actually remember what the student's submitted application was, which sort of was potentially important from a data quality side. So this shows mechanically what happens when the mechanism changes. So this displays for each year from 2015 through 2019, the share of students who are placed at different ranks on their application. And what you see is a really stark shift and a mechanical shift in 2019 away from placements in the first rank. So before 2019, almost everyone who was placed in their top ranked school. After 2019, you see more of an even distribution across ranks. It's important to note here that doesn't mean students are getting schools they like less, because the whole point of this change is that now you can truthfully list the school you actually like most first, whereas you had an incentive to strategize before that. And this is sort of just verifying that the policy did what it was expected to do. So that the change happened. What do we see? We now turn to our main findings. So our first result here is that strategic play following the mechanism change declined, or rates of strategic play declined and became decoupled from preference intensity, okay? So we define students as being revealed strategic if they list a school other than their stated most preferred school in a survey first on their application. And what we see in this left set of bars here is that under immediate acceptance, about 21% of students were revealed strategic in this sense, and it declined by about 50% to 11% of students following the change. Okay. The way that this happened is that it was students who had weaker preferences for their first choice school that shifted more. So under IA, students who had a relatively weak preference for their first most preferred school relative to their second most preferred school were much more likely to be revealed strategic. And this makes sense because these are exactly the students who don't really care that much about getting to their first choice relative to their second choice. They are willing to sort of trade off going to their most preferred school for, potentially for increased admissions chances. And we see that in the data. After the shift to DA, this relationship goes away and there's basically no difference by preference intensity and the rate at which students list their most preferred school first. So this is consistent with what we think the theoretical trade-offs between IA and DA are, which is that under DA, you don't really need to strategize, but at the cost of not being able to express your preference intensity. So we see that here, okay? It's important to ask, whether this 11% number of strategic players is a lot or a little. So we have a variety of measures of strategic play, values ranging from 2% to 11% under DA, with the answer depending on how we, the survey we use and how we measure it. These are actually similar figures to what Alex reports in his paper on the National Residency Match Program, which we were pleasantly surprised by, because the National Residency Program is very well established with a long history, and we're looking at the first year after the change in a public school choice setting. So I think we were pleasantly surprised by sort of how low these numbers were. What are people who play strategically in DA thinking? There are two main things we sort of saw here when we just asked people directly. The first thing is that some people just didn't get the memo about the policy change. So one person told us, quote, because my first choice school is competitive, I was told that the way the lottery algorithm works, my kids would lose their spot in any school if my first choice wasn't available. That would have made a lot of sense the previous year, but it's not the right strategy under DA. This is someone who, with better publicity, we might be able to get to play right in the future. We also saw some people giving definitions of strategic that don't really correspond to what economists think. These people are saying things like, well, it wasn't my first preference, but my child wanted it. So it's less about, it's more about inter-household negotiation than about, not playing in the optimal way necessarily. So what I want to spend the rest of this presentation talking about is why people, or why this change occurs. Strategic play seems to decline, rates seem to decline. We can imagine different reasons for this. It might be because people understood the change, analyzed the mechanism, and figure out the right way to do it. It might also be because people were just able to follow the new instructions that the district was able to give them. So the first thing we look at to assess that is about people's beliefs about their admissions chances. In our previous paper, we found that under IA, people had inaccurate beliefs about their chances of getting into different schools. So what this figure on the right shows is optimism, so the difference between your beliefs about your chances of getting in and your actual chances of getting in at the first ranked school on a hypothetical application. And we see that there's a lot of spread here around a mean of approximately 0. So these beliefs are inaccurate. Once we switch to DA, what we see is people's distribution of subjective beliefs actually stays pretty similar from year to year. So this graph on the right now shows the distribution of subjective beliefs about admissions chances at a school, at a first-ranked school on a hypothetical application, under DA in the blue bars and under IA in the clear bars. And to a first order, these distributions look pretty similar to us. That's a striking result because the true chances change a lot, right? So as you shift to DA, mechanically what happens is your chances of being admitted to your first-ranked school decline a lot because you no longer get an admissions bonus there. I've got a little message here. 5 minutes left, perfect, okay. And so despite the fact that we see this mechanical change in your true chances, your subjective beliefs aren't moving much. People don't seem to be sort of incorporating this change into their beliefs. How is play changing if beliefs aren't changing? Well, what's happening is that the relationship between beliefs and the applications people actually submit seems to go away. So what the graph on the right shows is how rates of truthful play, so listing your actual most preferred school first on your real application, how that varies with your subjective belief about admission to that school if you were to rank it first. We see that under IA, that's increasing, and this makes sense. People who think they're more likely to get into their most preferred school are more likely to actually rank that school first. Under DA, that relationship essentially reduces to 0, right? So people's beliefs are wrong, but beliefs are playing less of a role in the applications they actually submit. which again is consistent with what we think is happening, or what should be happening. We're sort of breaking the link between beliefs and play following the switch to DA. The fact that beliefs don't change suggests that, despite the big change in true value, suggests that people may not be fully understanding, may not be sort of analyzing the mechanism the way an economist might themselves, or might like to think that people would, depending on the economist. And to get more evidence on that question, we asked students some questions designed to sort of tell us whether they're about their understanding of the mechanism. So in particular, we asked students this question in italics right here. We said, if I list school A second on my application and am rejected for my first choice, am I less equally or more likely to be admitted than if I list school A first on my application? And so this sort of captures the key difference between IA and DA. Under IA, the correct answer is that you are less likely to be admitted because you're giving up that valuable real estate at the top of your application. Under DA, and especially the version of DA that we use here, there's not a penalty, right? So this graph, these bars on the left show the distribution of responses under IA. And on the right, it shows the distribution of responses under DA. And if you look at this, our interpretation is these are, again, essentially the same. So even though the mechanism is changing, stated understanding of the mechanism is not changing. The correct answer changes. People are actually more likely to be right under DA. But it's hard to look at this set of responses and feel like they really grasp this change in the rules, at least for us. And this is consistent with the small changes in subjective beliefs that people report to us about admissions chances. And also, together with that piece of evidence, suggests that instructions about how to play may be more important than the analysis of the mechanism for determining what people actually do following the change. It's also consistent with evidence in the lab from economics undergrads, for what it's worth. So just to conclude, what do we see here? So we've shown that the switch to DA in this school choice setting seems to work in terms of how it changes strategic play. Preference misrepresentation declines, although not to zero. The switch breaks the link between preference intensity and preference misrepresentation. And it breaks the link between subjective beliefs and strategic play as well. The reason for this does not appear to be because people analyzed the new rules and figured out the optimal strategy. It seems more likely that they were following the instructions that the district was able to provide. And this is actually pretty important from a policy perspective, because it suggests that in settings where you have sort of a trusted authority who can communicate this information, that may be sufficient to sort of get reasonable levels of compliance, even if the mechanism itself is sort of hard to figure out just based on, or if it's hard to figure out optimal play based on the stated rules. And the final point that we want to make here is that these results suggest that the counterfactuals that assume truthful play under DA may not be wildly off. So in our previous paper, we considered cases with up to 100% non-compliance with this kind of policy change. And we're seeing rates that are of non-compliance that are somewhere below that here. And perhaps welfare conclusions hold as well. So hopefully the next time I present this paper, I'll be able to tell you more about how counterfactual simulations compare to what we see, as well as what happens to our conclusions, the conclusions you can draw about welfare when you bring post-period data and pre-period data together sort of into a single framework, which is something that we think we can use this setting to contribute. And so thanks very much for taking the time to listen. And thanks also to my discussant for his valiant work in discussing the paper based on these slides.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Seth. And up next discussing, we have Alex.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the presentation. I'm Alex Rees-Jones, and I'll be discussing this paper. So the core motivating question that was addressed in the presentation today was, when you take student population, or a population of students in the school district, and switch the school assignment mechanism from immediate acceptance, which is gameable, to deferred acceptance, which is strategy proof, does their reporting of their preferences change in the way it should? So most simply stated, do people tell the truth once you incentivize them to tell the truth? Now, at the face of it, it sounds that our default answer is yes in these kind of settings, for economic theory at least, but there are plenty of good reasons to be worried that the answer might be more complicated than that. One that was already alluded to is that we make a huge deal about how simple the optimal strategy is. Oh, telling the truth is the easiest thing that could be, therefore everyone will do it. Well, that's true, but establishing that telling the truth is the optimal strategy is something that was the basis of math and OR papers in the 80s. And it's not so crazy to imagine that like some school children and some school children's parents can't prove things from math papers from the 80s. If you don't want to take like a little quip like that as real evidence here, I should point out there's also evidence along these lines. There's a large related literature, both primarily from the lab, but also a bit from the field, suggesting that at least some people have a hard time with this, which doesn't strike me as so surprising. So, this paper, this paper doesn't currently exist. It's primarily in slide form. So I don't know much more about the paper than you all as the audience, but I do potentially know a little bit more about this literature than some people in the audiences. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk through kind of the state of this literature and try to highlight the points where I think this paper is contributing. So the foundation of this is a quite large lab literature. There's too many papers for me to cite them individually, so let me just describe the template. The template is you get some students together, you put them through a simulation of deferred acceptance and maybe some other mechanisms. You assign the students' preferences, typically by saying, hey, if you match to the good one, you get $10, and if you match to the other one, you get $5 or something like that. And then you let them submit their preferences and say, do they tell them back to me in the order that I gave them to them? Now, the thing that you see across this wide range of papers is that the answer is, they do better at truth telling under under the deferred acceptance condition. And the answer, they don't all tell the truth under deferred acceptance. So the range of non-truthful reporting across the experimental papers I'm aware of is something like ranging from 19 to 45%. Now, you could look at that and say on the face of it, that's pretty bad if we're hoping this number is 0. I should say these numbers are much higher than you would get, are much more favorable than you would get under different mechanisms. And that's the basis for the claims that these things are working, but we're still a ways away from 0. And I should note that that's been true, since the beginning. The original paper that kicked off this experimental literature was Chen and Sumnes, where they wanted to convince Boston Public Schools to switch to DA. And they said, look, we'll put people in an experiment and show you get more stable outcomes and more truth telling if you switch to this. And they established that, and it worked in terms of convincing Boston Public Schools. But even in that paper, they're finding somewhere between 28 and 45% of students not telling the truth in deferred acceptance. There's a lot of additional comparative statics that come out of this literature that are interesting. Just to quickly rattle off a couple that are directly relevant. First, if you look at this suboptimal behavior that you see in the lab, it's not very easy to fix by just giving people more explanation of how the mechanisms work, which to me makes perfect sense if we're assuming that none of the truth telling actually comes from people being able to prove that this is optimal, but rather from believing some advice they're given. It's also not easily remedied by kind of generational advice. So you can put students in the lab, let someone play it for a while, figure out how it works, then tell the next person what to do, and then repeat and repeat, which is kind of our intuition for how truth telling arises in these markets. By over years, the market figures things out. It doesn't work in the lab. That's something we've seen at least. Now, I do lab type work. I'm obviously in favor of these kind of papers, but there's plenty of people who are skeptical of them. And I think there are good reasons to be skeptical here. When we see that in the lab, participants don't get it, what does that mean? Well, that means among this very particular group of subjects who are potentially different than school children and their parents, for example, they're failing to figure it out under the conditions of the experiment. And what are the conditions of the experiment? Well, we take some people into the lab who typically have no experience with DA. We give them 10 minutes of instructions. And by the way, if you look at the experimental instructions for a lot of these experiments, they're not very good. Like I wouldn't figure it out from what they wrote. Not all papers, I won't name any particular ones, but that happens sometimes. And then you say, okay, after 10 minutes of these instructions, does everyone figure it out? And the answer is no. And so that could very well be true, while it still could be the case that everyone in New Haven could figure it out when their assignment's on the line and when they have better advice given over a long period of time. So if you want to get over those kind of hurdles in this literature, you're going to have to do something like go to a lab and field type approach, or just go to plain vanilla regular field studies. So those are both things that have been done in this literature a bit. On the lab and field angle, I have a paper that, of course, I like a lot, although it's not clear how many other people like it that much. But it's this paper with Sam Skoranek. And the basic thing we were trying to do was trying to see, if these problems in the lab would persist in these types of lab games if we resolve the problems I was just describing. So what we did is we did a archetypal version of these lab experiments, but we did it among about 1,700 medical students And we had them do it right after they went through the residency match. And so the idea of doing this is saying, okay, we're no longer testing if I can teach them how deferred acceptance works. We're testing if the process of going through the real residency match taught them how it works. And the kind of interesting finding of all of this is if you take these presumably smart people, put them in a highly incentivized lab experiment right after going through the residency match, 23% of them don't tell the truth in that lab experiment, like right after the real match, which I take as a bad sign for whether or not everyone actually gets what's going on. We have some additional findings that are relevant to what was being discussed regarding the strategy advice that the students are receiving. Now, I think this is neat. Of course, you could still say, well, this is still studying behavior in these simple lab experiments, and we don't actually care about that. We care about what school children do in real matches. So then you're going to have to go to the field. Now, this issue that Seth has been talking about is well appreciated by people doing field studies, but there's not many studies that directly inform it, which is where this paper will come in. The main difficulty is that in order to actually answer the question he's posing, you have to be able to look at someone's preference submission and say, oh, that's not the truth. You actually like something else differently. And in general, we have some respect for heterogeneous preferences, so we're not going to want to point at a student who says, I really like this particular school that we think is bad, and say, oh no, you can't actually like that school. So what's the solution to overcome that? Well, one thing that's been used to some success recently is looking at very particular types of markets where you can basically rule out some truthful preferences. And that is by looking at cases where you can list options both with and without funding. So you do something like, say, if I'm ranking school A and school B, I have the ability to say, my first choice is to go to school A with a full scholarship. Second is school B with a full scholarship. Third is school A, but I pay myself. Fourth is school B and I pay myself. And the preferences I just described, there's nothing suspicious about them. But if you see someone submit the preferences, I prefer to go to school A on my own dime rather than with a $40,000 scholarship, you would generally say, oh, as long as we assume that more is better for money, they probably don't actually need that. If you use that test in field applications where this is present, you typically find people leaving money on the table because of that mistake. So the original application where this method was proposed was in the Israeli psychology match, where there's quite prevalent problems associated with this. Similarly, it's been applied in the nationwide Hungarian college match and the Australian college match. In all cases, you can rule out that everyone gets it, although there's some debate among these authors about how expensive it is that they don't get it. Okay, so with this rambling introduction of kind of where I view the literature to be, what is this paper doing? Well, it's examining a very well-trodden question that lots of people have weighed in on, and the thing that it's contributing is bringing in a pretty nice data set to this debate that's quite rare. So first, it's looking, rather than doing what most of these papers have done, which is look at a static environment and say, let's try to guess what's going to happen if we used a different mechanism. They're following people through a mechanism change. That by itself has been done plenty, but the things that they're layering on help us rule out some interesting stories. First, layering in beliefs about what they think their optimal strategy is. I think that's valuable and not many studies do it. And also, they layer on beliefs about chances to match at different places. That's very valuable, particularly for structural estimation, and that's extremely rare. So that's actually, to me, part of this whole thing that I find most interesting and most novel. This finding that basically people are changing their strategies, but they're not reporting any difference in their perception of their chance in ranking or in landing at their first choice. That's crazy, and I believe it. But that's a striking finding, and I can imagine myself and potentially others like me citing that an awful lot. And I look forward to seeing what comes of using that feature in the kind of structural estimates that I know they're building towards. So in terms of a takeaway for what you all should remember from this paper, by my perception, they're documenting another setting on the list of cases where we see switching to DA improves truth telling and other outcomes, but doesn't lead to kind of full compliance, which is what you might, which in some sense might be enough, but on the other hand is kind of a problem for some sort of structural approaches. And it's further documenting, and this is kind of the most interesting element to me, just how sticky strategies and expectations are as you go through such a reform. When it comes to problems in these authors' lives and trying to publish these results and for things that you should think about in interpreting them, having seen a bunch of these papers I'm citing go through the process, a common criticism is saying, well, look, you're the person who was running this this change. I understand, or you were at least involved, Seth. And you're telling us that when you did the change, not everyone understood how they should change their behavior. The most interesting version of that claim would be if we say, well, in general, when you switch to DA, this is a problem. But the kind of more cynical potential possibility is just say, hey, you did a bad job. Like, you should have explained it better to parents and students, and you should have better publicized it. For the record, both for Seth and for all audience members, I have no reason to think that Seth did a bad job. But documenting that is kind of in some ways a major element of the fight of establishing these results. And you're going to have to convince people that you did things in the way that everyone else would do them in order to establish this will be a problem when everyone else does it. With that, I'll end there, but thanks very much for the paper.
Great, thank you very much. Let me see. Please feel free to raise your hand if you have questions, and I can unmute you. Okay, no questions so far, Seth or Chris?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk for just 1 second. Yeah, thanks, Alex, for that great discussion and for providing so much context. That's really helpful, I think, hopefully for everybody else too. Yeah, I think you're making a great point that like a lot of this really depends on the implementation. I guess our hope here is that, I guess at some level, I view this kind of as a strength of the paper in the sense that this was, we were involved in convincing the district to switch, but the district really implemented this policy themselves. It's an actual policy. It's not really something we did. And my hope would be that what we can learn from this is kind of what happens when districts change, which I agree with you will tend to be, imperfect. I guess there is this challenge that I can imagine running into about saying, well, do New Haven's experiences generalize to, the experiences of other districts, which seems like a hard, a tough bridge to cross, but, I guess we'll have to see how that goes. Anyway, so that's the only thing I wanted to say. Thanks for providing all the great context and for braving, again, the discussion on the basis of limited data.
If it's okay to follow up on that. Yeah, I have no reason to believe that either you or they did a particularly bad job, but seeing a couple of these past examples, like with the Israeli psychology match, when they rolled it out, and they found out ex post, they're like, oh, we did a couple things that we thought were that don't look like they were a great idea, and also they don't align with best practices, and just kind of going through that ended up being important for the development of that project, and just to the extent that you can document that they were doing, what Proud Path Act would tell them to do, would be, very, very useful. And to the extent that they deviated from that, that could be informative as well. This will just be important for understanding.
Yeah, got it. That's a great point. I think we could definitely provide further documentation on that as we go forward. That's a great comment. Thanks.
Wonderful. Okay, if there are no other questions, we'll move on to our third paper of the session.
Great. Thanks so much. So our paper is on discrimination in hiring. And this is joint work with Simon Board, who's also on the panel here, and also Moritz Meyer-ter-Vehn. And so, of course, the motivation, employment discrimination exists, and its effects appear ubiquitous. And
Alan, can you maximize your slides?
Oh, yeah.
Thanks.
Is that better?
Better.
Great. So employment discrimination exists, and its effects appear to be ubiquitous. And it shows up in unemployment. It shows up in wage rates and many other places. There's a few prevailing theories. One, of course, is taste-based discrimination, which is consistent with minorities have, in a fictional context, minorities have longer unemployment spells and lower wages. Establishments appear to be racially segregated, and there's more direct evidence of implicit bias as well. There's another theory that we're particularly looking at in this paper is that of screening discrimination. And this theory is a little bit less established. but it's related to closely related to statistical discrimination, whereby whereas in classical statistical discrimination, employers observe something like the race of the applicant and they make inferences from there. Screening discrimination is specifically a version where perhaps some race managers could observe better signals of the productivity of one's own race. And so theoretically, it has many of the same predictions as taste-based discrimination, including racial segregation across establishments and wage gaps. But in other ways, the implications are the opposite. That's really what we're going to be exploring. So theoretically, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be deriving the testable implications of taste and screening discrimination. And then we're going, given productivity data. And then second, we're going to test those predictions on about 37,000 commissioned salespeople, white, black, and Hispanic commissioned salespeople who are hired by white, black, and Hispanic department store managers. And our main findings is that, first of all, workers' productivity has a higher mean and lower variance when they're hired by their own same-race manager, which we interpret as being most consistent with evidence, most consistent with screening discrimination as opposed to taste-based discrimination. And this also sticks to the manager who hired the worker, pointing that hiring managers also vary within the stores. We find that the result is primarily, especially largely driven by Hispanic workers and slightly less so by by white workers. And I'll give some, we have a little bit, I'll talk about some of the results for Black workers as well. I think it's self-evident that, of course, there is the discrimination exists and is very pervasive. It's particularly large for less skilled workers, like the retail workers that we're going to look at here. Juliana, Leonard, and Levine provide specific evidence for discrimination in retail, both in terms of segregation and hiring and productivity. I think the most, another very closely related paper, Glover, Pallais, and Parenti, sheer slow down when they're working under managers who are rated as biased in an implicit association test. There's been, of course, experimental evidence show that managers appear to pay to avoid hiring productive workers of other races. Jonas Hort has a similar paper as well. There's also evidence for statistical discrimination, of course, like Agan and Starr has the paper on ban the box laws. So employers, when they're not permitted to ask about conviction history that appears to hurt Black applicants who don't have criminal records. Challenging and Prey, of course. Evidence for screening discrimination is more sparse. Fissman, Paravicini, and Vig find that same caste borrowers borrow more and have lower default rates when their lending manager, when the lending officers are of the same caste. And Desmond et al. Find that minority workers fare better at firms with other minority workers, which they interpret through the lens of screening discrimination. I think there's a broader set of evidence outside of economics. So there's several papers in education showing that counselors are more effective at communicating with people who have a similar background that they do. If you look at the content of college counseling, that's seems to be the case. Also, there's a qualitative study by Neckerman and Kirschman that show that that managers just find it difficult to assess the ability of minorities who have different life experiences. And in a lab experiment, interviewers focused more on cultural fit rather than job fit when they're interviewing people of different cultures. Even though such interviewing techniques aren't very evident, I don't provide much of a signal. There's also, in psychology, there's a very large literature on what's called the cross-race effect, which is really just that people just don't update their beliefs very quickly when they encounter people of other backgrounds. And there's several papers in legal studies as well that show that people are very bad at identifying and distinguishing among people of different races. And so they just simply don't update very quickly because it's because of cognitive load or other issues that just make it so they don't update their beliefs. And so, there's someone in the last session I went to said that you have to be able to summarize your talk into Twitter. And so this is my favorite. This is This was so Marco Rubio posts, it was an honor to have served with John Lewis, may rest in peace. And then Sean King, a civil rights activist, said, that's actually Elijah Cummings, wrong black man. And so, this is just kind of speaking to this idea that we maybe have that we perhaps update our beliefs as quickly for other races. So we have a baseline picture. And so suppose that we have a productivity distribution. So this is the true productivity Y and an estimator. And so we get some signal as to the true productivity of a manager, gets some estimate as the true productivity of someone who they encounter. And then a simple taste-based model, we can suppose that people have a taste for discrimination. So they lower the bar, the productivity bar when they're encountering someone of their own race. And as they reduce the bar for hiring somebody of their own race, what that means is they end up dropping the mean productivity for their own race, and the variance will be larger as they kind of scrape the bottom of the barrel to exhibit their racial preferences. And so that's in contrast of screening discrimination, where your true estimate of their productivity is closer, where your estimate of the productivity is closer to the true estimate. And so in that case, you're making fewer mistakes when you're hiring somebody of your own race. And so in this case, the mean productivity will be higher and the variance of productivity will be smaller when you're hiring somebody of your own race. And so essentially given productivity distributions, we should be able to distinguish between the taste-based version of discrimination and like a screening version of discrimination. So, and so this is just simulation results. And so this shows the hypothetical gap in the different productivity percentiles when you're hiring somebody of your own race versus other races. And so under taste-based discrimination throughout the productivity distribution, your same race hires should be have a lower productivity than that same percentile for managers of other races who are hiring that race. And the opposite is the case for screening discrimination. And I think that the main takeaway here is that it's really the bottom coming up, right? Under screening discrimination, if you're getting better signals of your own race, then the productivity of your worst hire should be more productive than the productivity of other races, worst hires of that race. Okay, so the setting. And so what we have a large US retailer. They have a little over 1,000 retail outlets. And then I think one of the key features of these data is that these are department stores. So a little over 1,000 department stores. And each store has several departments. And so we have 37,000 some department managers or managers of departments within stores who are responsible for screening applicants within their department. And so those 37,000 department managers within the stores hire a little over 100,000 white, Black, and Hispanic commissioned salespeople. And since we have commissioned salespeople, we have a very good measure of their productivity. And so we're going to see whether the productivity of same race hires for those white, Black, and Hispanic managers is higher. And we're going to be looking at the variance of the productivity as well. As far as observables, for those workers, we're going to see the hiring manager's race, the worker's race, the sales per hour, which is the chief productivity metric, and it's the way that these commissioned salespeople are paid. We'll see their job, their department, their sales targets, their age, tenure, and so on. And so a little bit about the timing. The worker applies for a job. A lot of these applicants are in person, but they're like at a computer. If you go to a department store, which you shouldn't do these days, but if you do, then there'll be a computer and you can apply for a job on the spot. The headquarters is going to give a screening test. It's going to give a green, orange, red recommendation, which, so 3 categories. And then the department manager is going to observe the recommendation from the screening test, and then they're going to make a decision for hiring. And so the department managers are largely incentivized. They're salaried, but they have a non-trivial amount of their pay comes from bonuses based on the department's performance. So they also have an incentive to hire high ability, high productivity salespeople. As salespeople, we're going to be focusing on commission salespeople, so of course they have a large incentive to perform well as well. So here's the more informative figure for summarizing our paper. So these are the productivity distributions for the different race of managers and workers, and the productivity distributions of the workers conditional on the race of the manager who hired them. So I'm going to skip straight to the cleanest figure, but if you look at the bottom right, these are Hispanic workers who are hired by. The solid line is the Hispanic workers hired by Hispanic managers. And then the gray lines are the ones who are hired by either white or black managers. And so I think like one big takeaway is that the race of the workers and the race of the managers don't explain an enormous amount of the variation in productivity. There's a lot of residual variation here. But our chief claim is that this, if managers were really biased towards their own same race, and that was dominating any sort of screening effect, then we really should see a larger mass at the bottom of this distribution for the same race managers and same race workers. So the first result is a segregation. Now, there's an enormous degree of segregation across different departments. And so what we have here is we just have, this is a linear probability model. Just to make it easy to read, 100, it represents that the workers' race was, say, Hispanic. And so, so about 54% of all Hispanic workers were hired by were hired by a Hispanic manager. And so you can kind of look at this diagonal here, and it's just, the diagonal is very large compared to the off diagonals, meaning that white managers tend to hire white workers, black tends to hire black, Hispanic tends to hire Hispanic. And that's actually even the case even within stores. And so remember, we have departments within stores. And so even within stores, there's a few percent higher probability that that Hispanic manager ends up hiring a Hispanic worker. And so now this result is consistent with both taste-based discrimination and screen discrimination. So this could be because these managers are biased towards their own race and so lower the bar for their own race, or it could be that because they observe more high ability workers among the applicants of their own race because they get a stronger signal. And so consistent with both theories, we find evidence of segregation even within the same departments of the same store. Okay, so then we have the analysis of supermodular productivity. And so for this, what we're going to do is we're going to essentially run a thought experiment. So by supermodular productivity, we mean if you had like a white manager hiring a white worker and you had a black manager hiring a black worker, is that going to perform better or worse than, on average, than a white manager hiring a black worker and a black manager hiring a white worker? And so this is the different combinations: white, black, Hispanic, black, Hispanic. And overall, what we find is we do find evidence of supermodularity, meaning that the mean productivity is higher when workers are hired by their own race. And if you look at the coefficient estimates, the largest gap is the large part of the gap is really driven by primarily by Hispanics. And so here's those figures that we can relate back to the simulation results again. And so what we can see here is that, again, under screening discrimination, we should observe that the least productive hires of your own race are more productive than the least productive hires of that race hired by other race managers. And that's exactly what we find, especially, well, at least for Hispanic workers, the effect is very large. This is the solid line. It's a little bit less the case for white workers. For black, the results are a little bit more complicated. So this is, as we're going to show, the variance for black workers is a lot higher. and that's reflected both at the bottom and the top of the distribution. And so again, that's kind of like the, this Hispanic result is what's driving a lot of the supermodularity. So then the second part is going to be, we're going to analyze variance and productivity. And again, because under taste-based discrimination, managers are lowering the bar for their own race, we should see larger variance. And under screening discrimination, since they're getting better signals of productivity, we should see smaller variance. And so what we do is we calculate the variance ratios of same race versus cross-race hires. And fairly consistently, we find that, that the overall variance ratio tends to be smaller when we're comparing managers hiring their own same race workers. So the variance is about between like 90% to 95% before and after controlling for things like the location and job fixed effects. And so both of those sets of results are more consistent with screening discrimination. And in the paper, we also have a result for turnover, but I'm not going to show that here because it has the same predictions as hiring, and we find the same results consistent with both. One extension is, do managers get better at screening other races? And so what we do is we see, okay, well, really the crux of these hypotheses on screening discrimination, and especially in the psychology literature, is that it's really that people who have different backgrounds are bad at screening people, People are bad at screening people from other backgrounds. And so it could be the case that with more experience at the firm, working and supervising people of other races, perhaps they get better over time. And we actually find that the results are very consistent over time, and they don't appear to improve based on experience. And so, unfortunately, we don't find any evidence that they get any better. Other findings: workers hired by a same race manager have lower turnover. Controlling for performance explains some of the Black's lower turnover. Same race managers don't appear to be prior friends, or they don't appear to have share other demographic characteristics, and there's no segregation or difference in supermodularity when you look at someone who hired you. I think there's another large alternative explanation, which is that they're productive complements. And so maybe it's not the worker who hired you, but rather it could be that that you might work harder, or you otherwise are just more productive when you're when you're working under a manager of the same race. And I think we have 4 reasons why we don't think that this is the case. First, we find the same race productivity variance is higher. First of all, if you're in a world of complementarities, then the same race productivity should have higher variance under the same manager, because the most productive of your own race should be a lot more productive, and the least productive should be just a little bit more productive if they're hired by the same race. And so that should yield a higher variance. But we find evidence that the variance is lower when you're hired by your own race, which is consistent with a simple version of complementarity. We can also look at hires who are hired by one manager and then switch managers within the department. And for those results, we lose a lot of statistical power because a lot of people tend to stay within the same, either with the same manager, or because a lot of the races are so segregated across locations, even if they do switch managers, often to the same race again. But we find that that overall, that supermodular productivity is really sticky to the race that hires you, not the race you're working under. And third, supermodular productivity disappears with learning, and it doesn't appear to occur with internal transfers. And also, complementarity implies that it would, but we don't find that. And we also don't find any evidence that managers are trying to reallocate or sort workers under managers of their own same race, which would enhance their productivity if supermodularity was really what was going on. And so a lot of other theories of discrimination, I think we can go a long way relatively in this paper, because we can because we can control for location effects. So to summarize, taste-based discrimination and screen discrimination have a lot of the same predictions, but they have very different implications. So for example, under taste-based discrimination, you could enhance productivity by using a quota. Because under a quota, you're potentially forcing people to overcome their bias and hire the most productive people of other races. But under screen discrimination, that could, by itself, could make it so you're hiring people for whom you have worse productivity signals. I think also there's different implications for the effects of algorithmic hiring, and if you can get better signals of the productivity of different of people from other backgrounds, diversity in hiring committees, and many other potential implications. If you, if perhaps you gave, I guess, like screen discrimination more attention. And so one of the good news is outright taste-based discrimination may be less important in explaining racial disparities, but the bad news is probably harder to overcome even in the absence of bias. And so if you could have an intervention that merely reduces bias training, that might not necessarily reduce economic disparities. And I think it could be possible that something like algorithmic hiring that could reduce segregation if it enhances the signal that cross-race managers observe. Diversity initiative for senior management could work, or getting hiring committees that share a more diverse set of backgrounds and similar backgrounds to their applicants could potentially help as well. So that's it.
Wonderful. Thanks, Alan. And we turn to our last discussant, Aislinn.
Can everyone see my slides and hear me okay?
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, really nice talk, Alan. I really like this paper. So let me start out just by building up an economic framework for how we think about discrimination, and then I'll discuss how this fits within it. So if we look to the broader economics literature on discrimination, there's been two main sources. One is the taste or preference-based discrimination that Alan mentioned, and this is due to some sort of animus against members of a group, which was first posited by Becker back in 1957. And then the second major source is statistical. So we live in a world where there's inherent uncertainty about workers' productivity. And therefore, if we have different beliefs about different aspects of this learning process, as we learn about their productivity, this may bring discrimination into the mix, even if we don't have any sort of direct preference against one of the groups. So within statistical, we could think about three key different ways that have been explored in which this uncertainty may lead to discrimination. One is that evaluators or managers may believe that one group has lower average productivity at the population level. The second is also a population statistic. It could be that both groups have similar average productivities, but they have different variance in productivity. One group has, say, higher variance than the other. And then there's a third, which was explored in this paper, which and referred to as screening discrimination, which is similar population distributions, but different information or different precision of your signal as you learn about this productivity. There's also an issue of whether these beliefs are accurate or inaccurate, which I'll say a bit more on later. And why do we care about this? Well, if we want to have any sort of policy to mitigate discrimination or to evaluate the welfare of different discriminatory outcomes, then we need to identify the source. So it's not enough just to document the existence of discrimination. We need to understand what's driving that discrimination. So where does this paper come in? Well, this paper seeks to distinguish between two of these sources, taste-based and statistical due to differences in beliefs about the precision of the signal or screening discrimination. And this is a really important question, particularly because a lot of the literature is focused on distinguishing taste-based versus statistical, but primarily looking at differences in population statistics, the differences in average productivity, primarily, or even sometimes the variance of productivity. But really this third type of statistical discrimination, this screening discrimination, has the potential to be equally important in markets, but it's relatively understudied, at least from the discrimination literature that I'm familiar with. What are the key results? So a quick summary, since Alan already did a really nice job going through his empirical results. But the paper finds that, first of all, managers hire more same-race applicants relative to cross-race applicants. Second, same-race hires are more productive, conditional on being hired. And third, same-race hires have lower productivity of variance. So taken together, they argue that these patterns are consistent with screening discrimination, but not consistent with taste-based discrimination. All right, so let's delve a little bit more into what market conditions are relevant for screening discrimination. So one thing that's important when we're thinking about screening discrimination is what is the type of market? So to steal a term from the Bartos et al. Very nice paper on attention discrimination, they distinguish between what they call cherry picking markets and lemon dropping markets. A cherry picking market is a market in which the top applicants are selected from a large pool of candidates. So you could think of, say, admissions to an elite university, hiring for a very competitive job. The key thing here is that you're hiring fewer than 50. If there's a normal distribution of productivity, you're hiring fewer than 50% of applicants. So you're really looking to pick out the cherries from a large pool of applicants. The second type of market you can imagine is what's called a lemon dropping market. And so this is a market where most applicants are selected, and really you're just trying to learn about productivity or whatever the relevant trait is in order to just weed out the very low quality applicants. So here you can think, to take an example from the Bartos paper, you can think about, say, selecting a rental applicant. Most people are allowed to rent, but sort of a standard property, but you just want to make sure you sort of weed out the people who have a really bad credit history. Well, why does this matter? Well, this paper focuses on screening predictions in a cherry picking market. And the reason this matters, as I'll discuss on the next slide, is that the predictions differ by type of market. So as a first pass, one thing I would suggest looking at in the empirical data is this assumption, in part of the theoretical model, is this assumption supported by the data? One quick test would be if you could see if you have any data on how many people applied, you could just see whether 50% of applicants are hired. But further than that, I'm not sure if you have data on applicants as well as hires, but if you do, I think it would also be really interesting to see, is the type of market perceived to be the same for each applicant race? So in other words, is it a cherry picking market perceived to be a cherry picking market for Black applicants, for white applicants, and for Hispanic applicants? And further, does this perception of the market have any interaction with the manager's race as well? So I think some data on this would give us a really interesting insight into what exactly the form of screening discrimination is here, and also provide some validation for the assumption that you're looking at a cherry picking market. So as I said, the reason this matters is that screening discrimination actually has exactly the opposite predictions for a lemon dropping market. So you can think about Alan's really nice figure of the two normal distributions overlapping. In a cherry picking market, essentially you want a fatter upper tail is good because you're trying to pick the good applicants. In a lemon dropping market, it's actually the opposite. A fatter lower tail is bad because that means that there's more negative applicants. So here, if there's the same prediction that the variance of the estimator will be larger in the market if you have a more precise signal of the applicant's productivity, here that would allow same race managers to actually more effectively identify the bad candidates. And so therefore it would lead these managers to hire fewer same race applicants relative to different race applicants. So I think, as I said, this is really an understudied area of discrimination. And one thing that came to mind here was that an interesting question, building on similar techniques to what Alan, Simon, and Moritz used, could open the door to compare screening discrimination across different types of markets. So for example, you might be able to argue that often hiring is cherry picking. Usually there's limited numbers of job opportunities, so it seems reasonable that fewer than 50% of applicants are hired, especially in a labor market with a lot of unemployment. But you may think, on contrast, routine promotion or, say, evaluation after a trial period. Again, I know Alan broke the data into less than 3 months and greater than 3 months. I'm not sure that's because there's some sort of evaluation that takes place after 3 months if that's, say, a trial period. But you may think this sort of routine promotion or trial period is more likely to be a lemon dropping setting, whereas initially getting the job is a cherry pick. So you hire a few applicants, but then most people get the routine promotion, or most people are kept on unless they've done a really bad job. And so this also could have a really interesting implication for screening discrimination, in that it would predict a potential reversal where managers are more likely to hire same race applicants initially, but then they promote them at a lower rate. And so given that Alan brought up the implications for turnover predictions, again, taking this into account, if you're looking at turnover, if it's a specific evaluation after, say, this trial period, then you may want to make sure that the type of market is the same for the initial hiring and also for the for how the evaluation occurs after the trial period. Okay, another thing that I wanted to mention is, as I built in the framework in the first slide, was that there's really sort of 4 key types of discrimination. One is taste-based, then also the 3 types of statistical. Perceived differences in a population distribution or productivity is also an important source to consider. And if we think again about what the predictions are here, perceived higher average productivity is beneficial across all types of markets. If you think one group has a higher average productivity than another, you want to hire them more. Whereas perceived higher variance of productivity has a similar implication to the screening discrimination in a cherry picking market. It leads to higher hiring. So it's good in cherry picking markets. And although the hiring predictions are the same as taste-based and screening sources for these 2 other sources, I think it would lead to different predictions about the productivity mean and variance conditional on hiring. And so I think I would encourage you in the paper to broaden your framework to really think about these 4 different sources of discrimination and try and rule out all of the other 3. So try and make a solid case for screening discrimination by showing that it's not only the patterns you see are inconsistent with taste-based, but also they're inconsistent with perceived differences in the distribution of productivity. And so again, I think, similar to the way you set up the different predictions for the distribution of productivity conditional on hiring, I think you should be able to use similar models and similar predictions to also show what you observe is inconsistent with these as well. Another thing you could potentially do is tease out whether beliefs are accurate. So whether beliefs are accurate or inaccurate has been a recent area of discrimination of interest. Prior to, say, 5 or 6 years ago, people used to just assume that statistical discrimination was based on accurate beliefs. Now, with the wealth of data from psychology and behavioral economics and how beliefs may be inaccurate, we know that that's not necessarily a valid assumption at all times. Here, potentially, we could see that if all same race managers, say, believe that their own groups have higher average productivity, then, or if the patterns you observe are consistent with that, then that would be suggestive in inaccurate beliefs, because clearly not every group can actually have higher average productivity than the other 2. And so there may be other ways you could sort of also try and tease out whether beliefs are accurate or inaccurate based on some of the data you have. All right, so lastly, one important takeaway, or one important question that emerges once you document a source of discrimination is, how can you mitigate it, or how can you try and reduce this discrimination? Alan and his co-authors suggested that algorithmic hiring may reduce screening discrimination. If, say, there's differences in how different race managers are evaluating job applicants, then maybe an algorithm can eliminate those differences. So I think that's a really important takeaway, especially since algorithmic decision-making has become a really hot topic across, say, judicial systems, hiring, and a lot of different elements of decision-making in society recently. But I think in relation to screening discrimination in particular, there's a couple really important caveats to keep in mind here. So one would be to avoid building discrimination into the screening algorithm itself, which is a really important issue to take into account when designing an algorithm. It's really important to understand why these same race managers have a more precise signal. So 2 key ways I could think of that would lead to this would be, one is that the managers have a more accurate model of how to interpret hard information. So for example, let's suppose that we're looking at a job that requires GPA and SAT score, and you're just not sure what weight to put on them. Maybe for one race, it makes more sense to put a higher weight on GPA. They don't have as much, they have a lot of test score prep, so they do really well on the tests, whereas a different race, it makes sense to put more weight on the SATs. And so maybe those hiring managers just have more accurate models about which weight to put on different pieces of hard information. Whereas in contrast, maybe they're better poised to evaluate soft skills. So whether the person is going to be a personable salesperson, a conscientious employee, so on and so forth. Why does this matter? Well, first of all, if the soft information is really the important dimension here, that's a little bit more difficult to build into an algorithm. So we'll need to really think carefully about how we could design an algorithm in order to try and capture those differences in perceptions of soft information. It's especially important if the value of soft information varies by race. You might be tempted to say, no, it's too hard to code personality into an algorithm. Let's just use the hard information that we have. But if that hard information is a much better predictor for one race than another, then that's going to be something where actually, again, you have to worry about building the bias into the algorithm. Also, it's important, again, if you want to use these algorithms and there's, say, different models, you need to make sure you consult a diverse set of managers when designing the algorithm, again, to avoid building the bias in. That one's sort of obvious. And then lastly, if there are, say, different models for how to interpret hard information based on race that lead to these more accurate decisions for same race managers, but the algorithm can't explicitly use race for, say, legal reasons, or it's not socially acceptable, then an algorithm that just focuses on maximizing expected productivity of all hires may actually end up being biased in favor of the majority group because it can't differentiate between the two groups the way these same race managers are able to. And so again, designing the algorithm here, you want to make sure that you are actually able to replicate these same race managers screening same race applicants in an effective way. All right, so that pretty much wraps up the points I wanted to make. I think this paper makes a really important contribution, as I said, screening discriminations relatively unexplored relative to the other sources of discrimination. I think it's a really important question, coming back to what Lisa had said in her discussion. Hiring is an important question, and often we don't really know what's going on. And so especially related to hiring, how we learn about candidates and how that may lead to discrimination through the different signals we collect is, again, something that's important just in general to understand hiring, but also specifically to understand when discrimination arises in hiring settings. And so not only does this paper provide interesting evidence to document that this source of discrimination exists, but they also raise many important questions that I think future research can build on this paper in order to really nail down what form screening discrimination takes, what the mechanism is behind it, why it's present, and then lastly, how we can overcome it. All right, so thanks very much for including me in this session. I really enjoyed the talk, and that's it. That wraps up what I had to say.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We have a couple of questions. Let's start with Russell.
Great. Well, thanks so much. That was a super interesting paper and great discussion. I had a question that I think relates to some of the points in this discussion, but I'm just wondering the extent to which your data allow you to look at whether there are particular characteristics that same race managers are valuing differently in the hiring process than cross-race managers. And it'd be super interesting if you could do that at sort of all stages, like in terms of who to call for an interview, who to make an offer to, and who ultimately accepts. If you can like pinpoint, I know you mentioned something about demographics, but if you have something about like previous experience or age, or the types of applicant characteristics you can look at.
Yeah, thanks so much. And also thanks, Aislinn, for the great summary. I think, unfortunately, this is kind of a political thing within the firm, but we got really great data once they were hired. But since the hiring team is a different team that was really nervous about our work, we didn't actually get good hiring funnel data. I do know that, I do know. So I knew a couple things. So I think to Aislinn's point, I know they get a lot more applicants than they do have positions, but I think it's still fair to wonder whether this was still like a lemon job anyway, especially potentially for different races. It could be different as well, or other demographic groups. As far as like how they're searching, I was really interested in this question too, Russell, because the way that they're trained is a behavioral type interview. So, which means like, tell me about a previous life circumstance where you encountered like dishonesty, which my understanding from like some psychology papers shows that when you can't really relate to people's experiences, that's like particularly difficult that's particularly uninformative, or it's particularly hard to have like a behavioral type interview. I don't know like what else they're looking. I don't know like exactly what they're looking at as part of their interviews, but at least that part, at least to me, suggests that it might be difficult for them to evaluate people who have potentially very different experiences.
Joanna?
Hi. So my understanding of the Aigner and Kahn model of variance-based statistical discrimination is not that the variance for the minority group is necessarily absolutely higher than the variance for the majority group, but that variance based on a signal, on the signal that they have, or the quality, or something like that, like variance based on some specific signal or some group of signals is higher. And so with that, my question is variance-based statistical discrimination just a special case of screening discrimination when the hiring manager is white or from the majority group?
Simon, do you want to, this is kind of a theory.
So sorry, the question was about
is variance-based statistical discrimination just a special case of screening discrimination when the hiring manager is white?
Yes. So if you just look at a single, if we just had a single race, it would be from a white manager's perspective that that my same race applicants have a low variance, my cross race applicants have a high variance, and the issue is all of our identification really comes from comparing managers of different races. And so we try not to, we don't really have much to say about, we try to steer away from levels. And so a lot of the comparison is.
So this is just a more generalized theory of variance-based statistical discrimination.
Yeah, and I think it's partly because, if you're trying to look at the level issues, you get into these big differences about these issues about averages versus marginals.
Yeah, so I'm not talking about levels-based at all, just variance-based. And so you really are saying something about variance-based statistical discrimination because this is a more generalized theory of it.
Yeah, so I would say we're trying not to, we can't really identify. So if it was all managers of a particular race or workers of a particular race have higher variance, we're not really getting at that as much as more the kind of the between race comparisons. So that's why we're really kind of focusing on the screening discrimination, partly because of just what the data allow us to identify because of the, yeah. Thank you for the question.
Wonderful. In the last minute or two, do we have any other questions? Well, if not, thank you so much to all of the presenters, organizer, to the discussants. This was a fantastic session and I really learned a lot. So thanks everyone and have a great rest of your meeting.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Okay.